Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I wanted to discuss a topic that is related to manga but isn't specifically about manga. When we think of things like graphic novels and stuff, we tend to think of manga versus Western comics, and that's fair enough because those are the kind of two areas that are particularly large, but that ignores a lot of the other graphic novel industries throughout the world. But today I kind of wanted to discuss some of the ones that are kind of more influenced by manga and just kind of go over them a little bit, have a bit of a discussion, etc. etc. So starting off, I want to discuss OEL manga. OEL stands for Original English Language. So it's manga that was originally published in the English language. And as you can imagine, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. It wasn't until about the 1980s that any form of manga started to get released in English. So of course it makes sense that OEL manga wouldn't begin to arise until after that introduction. And it can be particularly difficult to define what an OEL manga is. Some seem pretty obvious. Some famous examples of OEL manga would be Mega Tokyo, as well as, I believe it's called Night School from Yen Press. But something that made that a little easier to categorize was the fact it was released by people who publish manga. Whereas something maybe like Scott Pilgrim is a bit more controversial to refer to as an OEL manga. Now it is interesting to note that this is published in the same tankobon size as manga. It's released in black and white artwork, and Brian Lee O'Malley, the creator of this series, actually did state that manga was a big influence on him. I particularly remember him mentioning that Ron Mahaf was a very big influence on him. So in many ways this fits the category for OEL manga. But I think I remember hearing that Brian Lee O'Malley himself rejected that term, saying that this wasn't an OEL manga. And in cases like that, it's a little harder to define what an OEL manga is. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that this is a tankobon size, that it's in black and white artwork, that it's influenced by manga, that it was originally released in the English language, fits all the categories of OEL manga. But, he definitely has the right to consider what this is himself. So from that perspective, the term OEL manga can be quite nebulous. Now, beyond that, I also wanted to discuss manhwa. To clarify, because I'll be saying something later on, the spelling of this manhwa is Manhwa, and it refers to Korean comics or Korean manga, whichever term you want to use. Basically, from what I'm aware of, manhwa started to be released in Korea under the Japanese occupation, but it wasn't until about the 1960s when there was an authoritarian government in charge of Korea that manhwa started to become more and more popular as a form of self-expression. And from that perspective, the history of it is really, really interesting. Now, the only example that I have currently on hand, but I'll show it to you anyway, pretty famous example of a manhwa series would be Bride of the Water God. Now, Bride of the Water God, there's a couple of things I want to mention about this, but I'll discuss that later. The first thing I want you to pay attention to, though, is its orientation. So notice here that the book is bound left to right. And it isn't a case of it being flopped like a manga from Japan. In fact, manhwa is released left to right in Korea. I have heard of some people saying, oh, I won't buy this because it's flopped, and the reality is that if it's a manhwa, it isn't actually flopped. This is the correct way to read the book. So I think that's pretty important information to know. And the last one that I wanted to discuss in this video is, wait for it, manhwa. Now, to explain what I mean by that, this spelling is Manhua. I looked up the pronunciation of those words, manhwa and manhwa, and to my English-speaking ears, they sounded exactly the same, despite different spellings. So that's why I thought I should clarify it. But manhwa is manga that was released in the Chinese language. And again, this has quite an interesting history. Manhwa began to originally be published I believe it was around the 1910s, around the time of I believe it's called the Xinhai Revolution, and it was used as a form of political propaganda, political discussion, political satire, etc, etc. And manhwa is definitely the area of these three that I'm the least familiar with, but I'll discuss that in a bit more later on. With regards to the orientations, from what I've read, in China, It's read from left to right, just like Korean manhwa, whereas I believe in Taiwan and Hong Kong, it is read from right to left, just like a Japanese manga. So that's another thing to take account of when you go seeking out some of these works. And speaking of, I kind of want to discuss now my own personal experience. So with regards to OEL manga, I've read a little bit of it. I have a little book that contains a wide variety of OEL stories. I've read, of course, depends on if you count it or not, Scott Pilgrim. I've also touched on some other stuff. I used to have the Star Trek Next Generation OEL manga, the Warcraft OEL manga, as well as, I believe it was the first 3 volumes of Amazing Agent Luna, but I ended up selling them just because I didn't feel that invested in their stories, I didn't really care about them, and I needed to make more space to be able to put my other manga elsewhere. So I haven't been blown away with any of the OEL manga that I've read, except for, if you count it, Scott Pilgrim. But I am curious to check out more of it in the future. Particularly, I've heard good things about Night School. With manhwa, Korean manhwa to be specific, I've even less experience than OEL. Obviously there's Bride of the Water God, which I would love to collect more of, but not only is it massively out of print, but I believe Dark Horse actually stopped releasing them. I noticed there's 24 volumes in Korea, but I think there's only about 17 in English, so it's an incomplete series, which really stopped me from being eager to pick them up. The only reason I actually have the first volume is because I found it for cheap at a used bookstore, and I was like, I might as well pick it up. I did read one other one, I believe it was called Jack Frost, and it was an alright one. It was one that I noticed had a lot of references to Japanese manga, lines from like Sailor Moon, and I particularly remember a line from Slayers, which, you know, kind of amusing. But in terms of actually the stories and characters themselves, I wasn't particularly invested, and so I ended up selling that one. Finally, manhwa, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong manhwa to be specific. I haven't read any of them. I've never gotten my hands on one of them. I do believe Yen Press released a couple of them back in the day. I don't know if they're still releasing them, but I didn't pick any of them up because I wasn't particularly interested in them, and I just had to prioritize others. So that was my discussion on OEL manga, manhwa and manhwa. It's definitely a really interesting topic, and as you might imagine, I would absolutely love to be able to experience more of these someday. It's just that I haven't had the best experience with some of the ones that I've read. So having said all that, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on OEL manga, manhwa and manhwa in the comments below. Have you read any of those? If you have, did you like them or dislike them? What are some series you'd recommend to me? What are your thoughts on these in contrast to manga? And of course, if you have any additional information about OEL manga, manhwa or manhwa, please leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon and Right Stuff affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase an anime or manga through those affiliate links, not only are you supporting me, not only are you supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the anime and manga industry. So I would highly encourage you to purchase through those affiliate links. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye bye.